6 months after cancer took my wife, I inherited my grandfather's lake cabin thinking it would be a peaceful place to heal. But the HOA immediately declared war on me, fined me thousands of dollars for having firewood, threatened to kill my dog for existing, and had no idea they were about to mess with someone who owned 60% of their precious lake. I never planned to be a cabin owner. My life in Seattle as a land surveyor kept me busy enough mapping out property lines for developers and private landowners. But when my grandfather Robert passed away 3 months after I lost Sarah, he left me his cabin on Silver Lake, a place where I'd spent many childhood summers fishing, swimming, and learning about the natural world. Sarah's death had shattered me. 18 months of watching cancer steal her piece by piece, then 6 months of stumbling through an empty house filled with her ghost. When the lawyer called about the inheritance, it felt like a lifeline. Grandpa Robert was a quiet, principled man who taught me more about land rights and property boundaries than any college course ever could. "Know your land, Trevor," he'd say. "Know every inch of it, because if you don't, someone else will claim it." I didn't fully appreciate those words until recently. The cabin itself was modest. A 2-bedroom log structure built in the 1960s with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch that offered stunning views of the lake. It wasn't fancy like the newer houses in the Silver Pine community, but it had character and history. More importantly, it came with Bear, my grandfather's aging golden retriever who'd been his constant companion for 8 years. Bear was the only thing that made sense anymore. In the empty weeks after Sarah's funeral, he'd sit with me in the silence, understanding grief in a way humans never could. When I inherited the cabin, Bear came with it, another piece of my grandfather's legacy I was determined to protect. The first weekend I arrived to start moving in my belongings, I noticed several residents giving my vintage pickup truck suspicious glances. The truck, also inherited from Grandpa, stuck out among the luxury SUVs and sports cars that lined the well-manicured driveways around the lake. I was unloading a box of books when a slender woman in her early 40s approached, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to stretch her facial features into a permanent look of disapproval. "You must be Robert's grandson," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Margaret Winters, president of the Silver Pine Homeowners Association. We were so sorry to hear about your grandfather's passing. He was unique." The way she hesitated before choosing that last word told me everything I needed to know about her true feelings. "I trust you're planning to make some updates to the property? The community has evolved quite a bit since this cabin was built, and we maintain certain standards of appearance and upkeep for all homes visible from the lakefront." I set down my box and shook her hand, feeling the chill that had nothing to do with the spring breeze coming off the water. "Nice to meet you, Margaret. I'm Trevor Thornton. I'm still settling in, but the cabin seems in perfect shape to me. Grandpa took excellent care of it." I could see her mentally cataloging everything she found objectionable. The natural wood siding that hadn't been painted in the trendy gray tones of neighboring houses, the native plant garden instead of manicured, lawn, the stack of firewood neatly piled against the side of the house, and Bear, who was sniffing around the property line with the curiosity of an old dog in a new place. "Well, you'll be receiving our welcome packet with all the community guidelines. I'm sure you'll find it informative." Her smile never reached her eyes. "We have monthly HOA meetings on the first Tuesday. You'll want to attend the next one to introduce yourself to everyone." As she turned to leave, she added, "And you'll need to move that truck to the garage or rear of the property. Visible parking of recreational or vintage vehicles isn't permitted in Silver Pine. Also, I notice you have a dog. You'll need to register him with the HOA and ensure he's up to date on all vaccinations and behavioral assessments." Before I could respond that the truck wasn't recreational but my daily driver, or ask what she meant by behavioral assessments, she was already walking away, phone in hand, apparently photographing other properties as she went. I was still staring after her when a friendly voice called out from the neighboring cabin. "Don't mind the Queen of Pine, she's on a power trip." The woman approaching had warm brown eyes and a genuine smile. "I'm Ellie Collins. I teach high school biology in town and live in that blue cabin over there. Your grandfather was my favorite neighbor. He used to let my students come take water samples from his section of the lake for our ecology projects." We chatted as I continued unpacking, and Ellie filled me in on the neighborhood dynamics. Margaret and her husband Thomas had moved to Silver Pine about 5 years ago, and she had quickly worked her way onto the HOA board, then to the presidency. Ever since then, it's been fine after fine, rule change after rule change, Ellie explained. They've forced out 3 longtime residents already by making compliance so expensive and complicated that selling was the only option. Your grandfather was the only one who never backed down. She lowered her voice. Be careful with her, Trevor. The Winters have plans for this lake, and your grandfather's property was the last piece that didn't fit their vision. That night, after Ellie left, I decided to explore the cabin thoroughly. Bear followed me from room to room, his tail wagging softly as he rediscovered familiar scents. In what had been my grandfather's study, I found a filing cabinet filled with property documents, surveys, and correspondence with the HOA dating back decades. As I sifted through the papers, a pattern emerged. The HOA had been gradually attempting to claim portions of my grandfather's land through easements, rule changes, and outright encroachment. But what caught my attention were the original property deeds and survey maps. According to these documents, my grandfather didn't just own the cabin and its immediate surroundings. He owned 60% of the lake itself, the entire North Shore, including the community dock. And surprisingly, the land beneath the HOA clubhouse. I remembered a conversation from when I was 12, fishing with Grandpa from that very dock. A man in an expensive suit had approached, asking to speak with him privately. When the man left, my grandfather seemed troubled. That man offered me enough money to live like a king for the rest of my life, he told me. All I had to do was sell this land. When I asked why he didn't take the offer, he simply said, Someday you'll understand why I never sold an inch of this land, Trevor, no matter what they offered. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. On my porch was a thick envelope marked Silver Pine HOA Official Notice. Inside was a 10-page document detailing all the ways my property violated community standards, with a helpful estimate for the required improvements totaling $18,000, all to be completed within 30 days. As I stared at the ridiculous demands, my phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. Got one too. Meeting tomorrow night to discuss community aesthetic concerns. You might want to be there. But it was the final page that made my blood run cold. Under pet compliance requirements, they demanded that Bear undergo a behavioral assessment by their approved veterinarian. Any animal deemed non-compliant with community standards would be subject to removal or, in severe cases, euthanization for the safety of the community. I looked down at Bear, who was sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, his gray muzzle resting on his paws. The idea that anyone could threaten this gentle old dog who'd never hurt a soul made me sick. The Silver Pine Community Clubhouse was an impressive structure with large windows overlooking the lake, a vaulted ceiling with exposed beams, and expensive-looking furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace. About 30 residents were already seated when I arrived for the HOA meeting, with Margaret standing at a podium at the front of the room. Beside her sat an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a stern expression whom she introduced as Victor Hayes, the HOA's legal counsel. I took an empty seat near the back, nodding to Ellie, who gave me an encouraging smile from across the room. As you all know, Margaret began, Silver Pine has been recognized as one of the most desirable lakefront communities in the region. Our property values have increased 20% over the past 2 years alone, thanks to our commitment to maintaining the highest standards. She clicked a remote, and a slideshow began showing beautifully landscaped homes around the lake. However, some properties are not in compliance with our community guidelines, which affects all of our investments. The next slide showed my cabin, photographed from an unflattering angle that made it look more rustic than it actually was. This property, recently inherited by Mr. Thornton, she gestured toward me without actually looking in my direction, requires significant improvements to meet our standards. The board has provided a detailed list of necessary changes. There were murmurs around the room as people turned to look at me. Some seemed sympathetic, others judgmental. We'll be implementing a new community beautification initiative to ensure all properties maintain the Silver Pine standard. Victor will now explain the enforcement mechanisms. Victor stood and adjusted his glasses. The HOA covenant gives the board authority to enforce compliance through an escalating fine structure and, if necessary, property liens and forced compliance measures. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than threatening people's homes. Additionally, the board can take direct action on visible violations and bill the homeowner for costs incurred. This includes the removal of non-compliant landscaping, unauthorized structures, and animals that pose a threat to community safety. I raised my hand, and Margaret reluctantly acknowledged me. I understand the desire for community standards, I said, but my cabin is structurally sound, well-maintained, and environmentally appropriate for its lakefront setting. The natural landscaping actually prevents erosion and filters runoff better than manicured lawns. I turned to address the room rather than just Margaret. Plus, many of these required improvements would eliminate the historical character of a cabin that's been here since before Silver Pine was developed. And regarding my dog, Bear is 8 years old, gentle, and has lived on this property his entire life. He poses no threat to anyone. Margaret's smile tightened. While we appreciate your concern for history, Mr. Thornton, the community has evolved. Your grandfather was granted certain exemptions due to his tenure, but those exemptions don't transfer with the property. The board's decision is final unless overturned by a 2/3 vote of homeowners. She quickly moved to the next agenda item, effectively shutting down any further discussion. After the meeting, a man about my age approached me. That was brave, speaking up like that. I'm Dave Wilson. I'm on the board too, though sometimes I wonder why. He spoke quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Look, Margaret and Thomas have an agenda here. They're developing a new luxury community called Silver Heights on the hillside overlooking the lake, and they need Silver Pine to look perfect to attract buyers paying 7 figures for those homes. Your cabin doesn't fit their marketing materials. He handed me his card. If you need any help navigating the situation, give me a call. Some of us aren't happy with the direction things are going. The next day, I contacted Sarah Reynolds, a property attorney recommended by a colleague. She reviewed my grandfather's documentation with growing interest. This is quite extraordinary, she said, spreading the surveys on her desk. Your grandfather was very thorough in documenting his property rights and the HOA's gradual encroachment. Based on these original deeds, you're right. You own much more than just your cabin lot. She looked up at me. Have you told the HOA about this? I shook my head. Not yet. I wanted to confirm everything was legally sound first. Something my grandfather used to say came back to me. In a game of chess, you don't show your queen until the right moment. Sarah nodded. Exactly, because once they know, they'll immediately try to challenge it. We should gather more supporting documentation from county records before making any moves. She made some notes. Meanwhile, document everything they do. If they're planting things on your property or making changes without permission, that's trespassing. That advice proved prescient. The following weekend, I returned from grocery shopping to find a landscaping crew planting a row of uniform shrubs along my property line. When I asked what they were doing, the foreman handed me a work order from the HOA for community frontage beautification. I politely but firmly asked them to leave my property. The next day, I received a $500 fine for removing approved landscaping and interfering with authorized HOA maintenance. As predicted, the Community Beautification Initiative targeted my property specifically. I began finding HOA violation notices regularly, each more absurd than the last. My vintage truck was deemed an unauthorized recreational vehicle. My stack of firewood was a fire hazard, despite being exactly as my grandfather had always kept it. The bird feeders were unauthorized wildlife attractions. But the worst was yet to come. A week later, I found Bear cowering in the corner of the cabin, whimpering. There was a dart in his side, a tranquilizer dart. Attached was a note. Behavioral assessment scheduled. Failure to comply will result in animal removal. My hands shook as I called the emergency vet. Bear was okay, but the message was clear. They were willing to hurt my dog to get to me. That night, something inside me snapped. I couldn't fight them just through legal channels anymore. I needed help, real help from people who understood what was happening here. I set up my phone and started recording. Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Thornton, and I'm fighting for my life here. My voice cracked as I looked at Bear, still groggy from the tranquilizer. 6 months ago, I lost my wife to cancer. 3 months later, I inherited my grandfather's cabin on Silver Lake, thinking it would be a place to heal. I walked the phone around the cabin, showing the violation notices taped to my door, the survey flags marking my property, and Bear, recovering on his bed. Instead, I found myself in a war with an HOA that's determined to steal my land for a luxury development. They've fined me thousands of dollars for having firewood. They've threatened to destroy my home. And today, I had to stop, my voice breaking. Today they shot my dog with a tranquilizer dart because they want to have him killed. I held up the dart, my hands trembling. This is Bear. He's 8 years old. He belonged to my grandfather for his whole life, and now he's all I have left of my family. They say he's a threat to community safety, but the only threat here is to decent people trying to live their lives. The video was raw, emotional, and real. I posted it on TikTok, YouTube, and Reddit without expecting much. I just needed to tell someone what was happening. I went to bed that night feeling more alone than I had since Sarah died. I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. The video had exploded overnight. 50,000 views and climbing. Comments poured in from people sharing their own HOA horror stories, offering legal advice, and expressing outrage at what was happening to Bear. By noon, local news stations were calling. By evening, the story had been picked up by national outlets. HOA threatens to kill grieving widower's dog was trending on social media. The attention was overwhelming, but it brought something I desperately needed: support. A legal defense fund started by strangers raised $25,000 in 2 days. Lawyers from across the country offered their services. And most importantly, people started digging into the Silver Pine HOA's finances and connections. Margaret's response was swift and vicious. She gave interviews calling me a disgruntled newcomer seeking attention and claiming the video was manipulated to create a false narrative. But the damage was done. People were watching now. The surveillance cameras I'd installed after the break-in attempts captured everything that happened next. At 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night, I was awakened by Bear's frantic barking. Through my bedroom window, I saw flames. Someone had set fire to the wood pile against the side of my cabin. I grabbed Bear and ran outside, calling 911 as I watched the fire spread toward the cabin's siding. The volunteer fire department arrived within minutes, but not before significant damage to the cabin's exterior. But that wasn't the worst part. As I stood watching the firefighters work, I heard Bear yelping in pain. In the chaos, someone had thrown something at him, a rock that caught him in the ribs. He was hurt, limping, and terrified. That's when I saw him. Thomas Winters, standing in the shadows near the tree line, watching my cabin burn with a satisfied expression on his face. I was done playing defense. The next morning, still smelling like smoke and with Bear recovering at the emergency vet, I called Sarah Reynolds. They crossed the line, I told her. I'm ready to fight back with everything we have. Good, she said. Because I've been busy. You're not going to believe what I found in the county records. We met at the county courthouse where Sarah had spent the previous day digging through historical documents. Brian Cooper, the records clerk who had been helping her research my property boundaries, greeted us warmly. Your grandfather was something of a legend around here, he told me as he spread out the original survey maps. Most people don't pay much attention to property lines until there's a dispute, but Robert Thornton knew every inch of his land and made sure every transaction was properly recorded. Brian confirmed what the documents already told us. My grandfather had indeed purchased the lake bed during the drought of 1977 when water levels were at historic lows, giving him control of 60% of the lake. He had granted easements for community water access, but maintained ownership of the land itself. Most importantly, the Silver Pine HOA clubhouse had been built partly on Thornton property, with only a limited-term lease that had expired 3 years ago. Your grandfather never renewed it, Brian explained. He filed a notice of lease expiration, but I guess the HOA ignored it, thinking he wouldn't press the issue. He stamped official copies of all the relevant documents for us. If you need a witness regarding these records, I'd be happy to testify. Robert Thornton was one of the good ones. Always did things by the book. Sarah was practically gleeful as we left the records office. This is better than I expected. They've built their entire community center on land they don't own, and they're using your dock without permission. Plus, they've documented their own harassment campaign against you through all these violation notices. She tapped the thick folder of HOA correspondence. It's time to develop our counterattack. Over lunch at a nearby cafe, we mapped out a strategy. We won't respond directly to the eviction notice yet, Sarah advised. Let them think they're winning while we gather more evidence and prepare our case. Meanwhile, I'll draft formal notices regarding their unauthorized use of your property. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I spotted a familiar face on my porch. Dave Wilson looked nervous as he handed me a flash drive. I can't be seen talking to you, he said quietly, but you need to see these emails. Margaret and Thomas have been explicit about their plans in board communications. They're trying to force out specific homeowners to improve community aesthetics before the Silver Heights launch. He glanced around anxiously. I've been documenting their actions for months, waiting for someone who could actually stand up to them. I think that's you. The emails were damning. Thomas Winters had identified my cabin as the primary aesthetic detraction visible from the Silver Heights overlook, and Margaret had outlined a step-by-step plan to force me out through aggressive covenant enforcement. Other emails discussed using HOA funds to make landscape changes to my property without permission, and even the strategic placement of cameras to monitor my activity. Most disturbing were the messages discussing the planned eviction, with Thomas writing, "Once we control the Thornton eyesore, we can proceed with Phase 2 of the development plan." But it was the final email that made my blood boil. Margaret had written to Thomas, "The dog situation is perfect leverage. Emotional attachment to pets makes people irrational. Push the euthanization angle. It will break him." They had planned to hurt Bear from the beginning. That evening, I attended another HOA meeting, this time with a different approach. Instead of arguing or defending myself, I took detailed notes and recorded everything on my phone. After the meeting, Margaret approached me with a cold smile. "I hope you're reconsidering your position, Mr. Thornton. It would be so much easier for everyone if you simply brought your property into compliance, or perhaps you'd consider selling. I know several investors who would pay market value for your rustic cabin." "I appreciate your concern," I replied evenly, "but I'm not planning to sell. My grandfather loved this place, and so do I." I gestured toward the lake. "It's an important part of Silver Lake history." "History doesn't pay the bills," she snapped, her pleasant facade cracking. "And it certainly doesn't maintain property values. Silver Pine is evolving, Mr. Thornton. Evolve with it or get out of the way." As I walked to my truck, I noticed a fresh scratch along the driver's side, a single word carved into the paint. Leave. I discreetly activated the camera on my phone and walked around the vehicle, documenting the damage. Looking up, I noticed a security camera mounted on a nearby lamppost. Perfect. If it had captured the vandalism, it might identify the culprit. Through Dave, I obtained the security footage from that evening. The video clearly showed Thomas Winters approaching my truck, looking around to ensure no one was watching, then using his keys to scratch the threatening message. I sent the footage to Sarah, who added it to our growing file of evidence. The next day, a formal summons arrived indicating that the HOA was taking legal action to enforce the eviction. Sarah reviewed the documents with a confident smile. "They've played right into our hands. Now we can bring everything into the open through legal discovery." She began preparing our response, which would include counterclaims for harassment, trespassing, property damage, and unauthorized use of my land. As we left her office, we spotted Thomas Winters in the parking lot of the lake's public access area, meeting with representatives from a construction company. They were examining blueprints spread across the hood of his luxury SUV. I didn't need to see the plans labeled Silver Heights Luxury Lake Access to know what they were discussing. The development on the hillside overlooking the lake was nearing completion, and they needed to finalize the exclusive lake access they'd been promising potential buyers, access that required controlling my property. Walking back to my cabin, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about defending my home anymore. It was about protecting my grandfather's legacy, the lake he had loved so much, and Bear, who deserved to live out his golden years in peace. The morning after receiving the legal summons, I hired a professional surveyor, a former colleague who owed me a favor, to mark the exact boundaries of my property based on the official records. By afternoon, bright orange survey flags dotted the landscape, many of them in surprising locations. Several flags stood in what the HOA had been treating as community space near the shore. Others marked boundaries through portions of the landscaped community entrance. Most notably, a line of flags ran directly through the clubhouse building and across the dock. Margaret's reaction was swift and predictable. Within hours, she was at my door, a security guard from the HOA in tow. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, waving toward the survey flags. "You can't just mark up community property on a whim." "It's not community property," I replied calmly, handing her a copy of the official survey. "According to county records, these markers accurately reflect my property lines, including, you might notice, the land under your clubhouse and dock." Her face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. These boundaries were settled decades ago." "Actually, they were," I agreed, "just not in the way you thought. My grandfather granted an access lease for the clubhouse location, but it expired 3 years ago. As for the dock and lake access, he owned 60% of the actual lake bed, which gives me control over structures built on it." I handed her another document. "This is formal notice that the HOA is currently trespassing on private property. You have 14 days to remove unauthorized structures or negotiate a new lease agreement." After they left, I called Dave to warn him about the likely emergency board meeting that would follow. Sure enough, within hours, Margaret had convened the board to discuss what she called a hostile takeover attempt of community property. Dave secretly recorded the meeting for me, capturing Margaret's increasingly frantic attempts to dismiss my claims and Victor's growing concern as he reviewed the documentation I'd provided. Over the next week, word spread through Silver Pine about the property dispute. Many homeowners, particularly those who had suffered under Margaret's regime, reached out to express their support. Ellie organized an informal gathering at her cabin where I explained the situation to concerned neighbors. "I'm not looking to restrict anyone's enjoyment of the lake," I assured them. "Unlike the current HOA leadership, I don't believe in using property rights as a weapon. I just want fair treatment and recognition of my legitimate ownership." Margaret responded by escalating her campaign against me. HOA landscapers attempted to remove my survey markers, only stopping when confronted with trespassing charges. A large truck mysteriously blocked my driveway one morning, requiring a tow truck to remove it. The HOA newsletter included a special feature on community threats and property values, with a poorly disguised reference to non-conforming properties that endanger everyone's investments. The situation took a darker turn when Thomas Winters approached me directly as I was checking my mail. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, his voice low but intense. "People who fight the HOA end up leaving one way or another. Save yourself the trouble and take a fair offer for that shack." When I didn't respond, he added, "This is bigger than you understand. Silver Heights represents a $50 million investment. We won't let some cabin-dwelling nobody derail it." That night, my water mysteriously stopped working. The emergency plumber discovered that the main line to my cabin had been deliberately damaged where it ran near the community access road. The repair cost $800, coincidentally similar to my latest round of HOA fines. But the viral video had changed everything. National media attention meant that every move the HOA made was now being watched and documented by thousands of people online. When the water line was sabotaged, the story made national news within hours. HOA sabotages widower's water supply and property dispute became the top trending story on social media. The public outcry was fierce, and advertisers began pulling sponsorship from Thomas Winters' development projects. Using my grandfather's extensive documentation and the new evidence of harassment, I filed a formal complaint with the county about the HOA's actions. The complaint detailed the pattern of targeted enforcement, the unauthorized entry onto my property, the surveillance, the vandalism, and most damning, the deliberate harm to bear, all tied to the effort to force me out for the benefit of the silver. Heights development. Margaret's reaction revealed her desperation. Rather than backing down, she doubled down. Community security patrols began driving past my cabin hourly. New violation notices appeared daily, each more absurd than the last. In a particularly bold move, a community safety inspection was scheduled for my property without my consent. The situation reached a breaking point when I returned home one afternoon to find a construction crew at the community dock, which my survey had confirmed was mostly on my property. The crew was measuring and marking sections of the structure with spray paint. When I asked what they were doing, the foreman showed me a work order for a dock renovation project from the Silver Pine HOA, complete with a county permit bearing Margaret's signature certifying HOA ownership of the dock area. I immediately called the sheriff's office. When Deputy Hart arrived, he reviewed both sets of documents with growing concern. "This is a civil matter regarding the property dispute," he finally said, "but falsifying permit applications is another issue entirely." He instructed the construction crew to halt work until the ownership dispute was resolved. "I'd advise everyone to maintain the status quo until a court can sort this out," he told me. "This is going to get ugly before it gets better." That night, unable to sleep, I sat on my porch with Bear, who was finally feeling better after the tranquilizer incident. Around 2 a.m., movement near the property line caught my attention. My security camera captured Margaret and Thomas examining my survey markers with flashlights, whispering intently as they made notes on a clipboard. Whatever they were planning, it was clear they weren't giving up without a fight. The county scheduled a hearing regarding the property dispute for the following month, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. News of the conflict spread quickly through the community, creating a clear divide. Those who had suffered under Margaret's strict regime rallied behind me, while others worried that any challenge to the HOA's authority might threaten their property values. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a feature titled "David vs. Goliath. Cabin owner fights developer-led HOA," complete with photos of my modest cabin juxtaposed against the imposing Silver Heights development on the hillside. But it was the online support that truly amazed me. The viral video had created a community of people who understood exactly what I was going through. Donations continued to pour in for legal fees, and legal experts offered their services pro bono. Most importantly, people were investigating Margaret and Thomas's business dealings, uncovering a pattern of similar tactics used in other communities. Sarah and I spent long hours preparing our case, gathering testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed the harassment campaign, organizing my grandfather's extensive documentation, and building a timeline of the HOA's escalating tactics. Through it all, I continued to live in the cabin despite increasingly uncomfortable conditions. The HOA had found ways to make daily life difficult. Security patrols shining lights in my windows at night, sudden maintenance that blocked my driveway, and constant photography of my activities. During my regular visits to town, I discovered something unexpected. I had become something of a local hero. The diner owner refused to let me pay for coffee, telling me, "Anyone standing up to those Silver Pine snobs eats free in my place." Longtime residents shared stories of my grandfather and his stubborn defense of the lake's natural character. As our preparations continued, Dave provided a crucial piece of evidence: financial records showing that Margaret had been collecting rental fees for the community dock and boat slips, money that never appeared in the HOA's official accounts. Further investigation revealed a pattern of financial improprieties. HOA funds used for consulting services provided by Thomas's development company, inflated contracts with vendors who contributed to Thomas's political campaigns, and most damning, evidence that fines collected from homeowners were being diverted to a separate account controlled by Margaret. Margaret's response was swift and desperate. The HOA's attorneys filed an emergency injunction to prevent me from interfering with community property, seeking to have my survey markers removed and my cease and desist orders invalidated. The filing painted me as a vindictive heir attempting to hold the community hostage over outdated and invalid property claims. The day after the injunction was filed, I woke to find a small group of residents protesting outside my cabin, holding signs with slogans like "Protect our community" and "Don't sink Silver Pine." Margaret stood among them, speaking animatedly to a local reporter about the threat to property values my actions represented. But the tide was turning. For every protester Margaret could muster, 10 more people showed up to support me. The viral video had brought national attention to HOA abuse, and Silver Pine had become the symbol of everything wrong with overzealous homeowner associations. That evening, my security cameras captured Thomas attempting to remove my property markers under cover of darkness. When confronted with this evidence, the HOA claimed he was simply inspecting the markers to ensure they hadn't been tampered with. A transparent lie that further undermined their credibility. The situation took an even more serious turn when Dave discovered construction permits filed with the county for my property, permits I had never authorized. The applications, submitted by a company owned by Thomas, contained a forged signature purporting to be mine. The planned construction was a lake access facility serving the Silver Heights development, to be built directly on my lakefront property. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, Margaret requested a private meeting with me. Against Sarah's advice, I agreed, stipulating that we meet in the neutral territory of a coffee shop in town, with Dave present as a witness. Margaret arrived looking uncharacteristically subdued, her usual polished appearance slightly frayed around the edges. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot," she began, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This dispute isn't benefiting anyone, and the negative publicity is harmful to the entire community. I'd like to propose a solution that works for everyone." She slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer letter for triple the market value of my cabin and property. "This is a very generous offer, Trevor. You could buy any house you want with this amount. Why fight to stay where you're clearly not welcome?" I closed the folder without examining the details. "This isn't about money, Margaret. It never was. My grandfather could have sold to developers decades ago and lived like a king. He chose not to because he understood that some things are worth more than money." Her pleasant facade cracked. "Don't be naive. Everything has a price. Name yours, and this all goes away." "I already told you. It's not for sale. Not to you, not to Thomas, not to anyone." I pushed the folder back across the table. "I'll see you at the hearing." That night, I found a final letter from my grandfather tucked inside a copy of Thoreau's Walden on his bookshelf. The letter explained his decades-long protection of the land as a mission to preserve what the lake was meant to be, a reminder that not everything in this world needs to be improved by human hands. My contemplation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had thrown a rock through my kitchen window. Rushing to investigate, I discovered my front door ajar. The cabin had been broken into while I was meeting with Margaret. A quick inventory revealed that my grandfather's original property deeds and several key documents were missing from my desk. The security camera footage showed a figure in a hooded jacket entering the cabin and going directly to the desk. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Despite the disguise, I recognized Victor's distinctive gait as he hurried away with a folder of documents. With the hearing scheduled for the following morning and key evidence now missing, I felt a moment of genuine despair. As I was contemplating my next move, my phone rang. It was Ellie, her voice urgent and excited. "You need to get to Frank's house now. You won't believe what he found." Frank Miller's small house was crammed with historical artifacts and documents from several decades of researching local history. When I arrived, he was practically bouncing with excitement. "I knew I had seen it somewhere," he said, leading me to a table covered with old county archives. "When you mentioned the drought of '77 and your grandfather's purchase of the lake bed, I remembered documenting it for the Historical Society." He pointed to a yellowed newspaper article with the headline, "Local Man Buys Lake Bottom During Drought." Beside it were official county records showing my grandfather's purchase of the exposed lake bed, complete with survey maps and legal descriptions. "These are certified copies from the county archives," Frank explained. "I was the county historian for 20 years before I retired. These documents have been in official storage all this time, completely separate from your grandfather's personal papers." I could have hugged him. "Frank, they broke into my cabin and stole the original documents. This might save my case." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Theft and breaking and entering? That goes beyond HOA bullying." He gathered the archives carefully. I'll bring these to the hearing myself and testify to their authenticity. No one can question county records or suggest you fabricated them. The Silver Pine Community Center was packed the next morning for the county hearing. The room had been divided, with HOA representatives and their supporters on one side and those supporting my position on the other. Margaret sat at the front table with Victor and Thomas, all three looking confident despite the setback of the break-in, not yielding all the evidence they had hoped to eliminate. But something was different. News cameras lined the back of the room. The viral video had turned this into a national story about HOA overreach. Margaret's attorney argued my claims were outdated, but Sarah methodically destroyed their case. We presented certified county records, security footage of Thomas vandalizing my truck and Victor breaking into my cabin, and testimony from Dave about their financial crimes. The most damning evidence came from Ellie's high school biology class, whose water samples proved Thomas's Silver Heights development was illegally polluting the lake while Margaret's HOA covered it up. But the moment that sealed their fate was when I played Margaret's recorded words. The dog situation is perfect leverage. Emotional attachment to pets makes people irrational. Push the euthanization angle, it will break him. The room erupted. Even Margaret's supporters gasped at the cold calculation behind threatening Bear's life. During a break, Thomas approached me in barely controlled panic. "Name your price. Whatever your grandfather turned down, I'll double it." "This stopped being business when you threatened to kill my dog," I replied calmly. "Those were criminal acts." The commissioner's ruling was unequivocal. My property ownership was confirmed, including 60% of the lake and the land under their clubhouse. All fines were invalidated, and the evidence was referred to prosecutors for criminal charges. Within weeks, Margaret and Thomas resigned amid criminal investigation. Victor cooperated with prosecutors, revealing the full financial scheme. The Silver Heights development collapsed as investors fled and environmental regulators launched investigations.